The man standing at the podium possessed an inherent, almost instinctual appreciation for the tactile world, and he could not help but notice the profound elegance of the Congresswoman's hijab. It was crafted from a truly magnificent textile, an exquisite weave that captured the harsh lighting of the room with a subtle, muted grace. He was a man who had spent half a century entrenched in the high-stakes theater of commercial real estate. He understood the hidden language of quality he knew: fabric. From the tremendous, custom-loomed draperies that adorned the expansive windows of his premier architectural properties to the bespoke tailoring of his own suits, he recognized luxury when he saw it. And the material framing, the face of the Congresswoman from Minnesota's 5th District, was undeniably some of the finest he had ever seen. It was a brisk Thursday afternoon in February of 2026. The President of the United States stood anchored at the northern end of the storied East Room of the White House, presiding over a joint press conference ostensibly dedicated to border security protocol and federal fraud enforcement. It was the specific breed of Washington spectacle where the heavy mechanical hum of high-definition broadcast cameras dominated the acoustic space, outnumbering the credentialed reporters by a ratio of 3-1. Every syllable echoing off the gilded molding and cold marble walls was being instantly digitized, fiercely clipped, hastily captioned in an array of bold algorithmic fonts, and violently uploaded to a half-dozen global social platforms before the sound waves had even settled. Scanning the audience, his gaze locked onto her. She was seated securely in the 4th row. Her arms were crossed defensively across her chest, and her face bore the composed, slightly elevated expression of a seasoned political operative. A woman who had decided somewhere in the brief window between stepping out of her armored motorcade and signing the official security ledger at the East Room's mahogany doors, that whatever political theater was about to unfold would inevitably be weaponized for her evening fundraising email scheduled for dispatch precisely at 9 o'clock that night. Ilhan Omar was impeccably ready. In truth, she was always ready. She had existed in a state of perpetual high-alert readiness since the bitter winter of February 2019, when the fierce blowback from her statements regarding lobbying organizations first ignited a national firestorm. She had been ready since April of that same year, when a brief, heavily circulated video clip regarding historical tragedies made her the focal point of a deeply polarized nation. She remained ready through the spring of 2020, when she married her chief political consultant, and through the icy January of 2023, when a unified Republican bloc forcefully stripped her of her seat on the prestigious Foreign Affairs Committee through every harrowing chapter of her tenure. The relentless, suffocating wave of death threats, the constant presence of heavily armed federal security details, the impassioned floor speeches, the glossy magazine covers, the formal motions of congressional censure, and the endless, a stream of viral outrage. She had methodically refined her public countenance into something approaching a high art form. It was a look of weaponized serenity, calm, precise, utterly unhurried. It was the unyielding face of a woman who had miraculously survived the blood-soaked devastation of a brutal civil war in Somalia, endured 4 agonizingly formative years, confined within the dusty, hopeless perimeters of a Kenyan refugee camp, and subsequently navigated 12 bruising years within the ruthless gauntlet of American politics. She had quietly concluded that all 3 arenas were roughly equivalent in terms of sheer existential difficulty. Consequently, she had arrived at the deeply settled philosophical view that the absolute best possible response to any targeted attack was to project the flawless illusion that the strike had never landed at all. Her mobile device rested in her left hand, the screen currently dark but instantly accessible. Positioned strategically in the back row of the press gallery, were three of her most trusted communications staffers, their sleek laptops, flipped open browser tabs. Loaded, they possessed pre-drafted, meticulously focus-grouped responses prepared for approximately 17 different variations of what might transpire next. Waiting only for an affirmative keystroke in the compose window she possessed. In every meaningful sense of the word, a system. It was a well-oiled, battle-tested 7-year-old operational machine designed to seamlessly transform conservative outrage into progressive ammunition. However, what the Congresswoman had failed to accurately model, what her elite communications team had not adequately stress-tested, and what her own profound confidence had ultimately fatally dismissed, was the vast, terrifying chasm between being attacked by Donald Trump on a digital social platform and being prosecuted by him in the flesh, under the blinding chandeliers of the East Room. On social media, Omar operated comfortably within her natural apex environment. She enjoyed the luxury of delayed response times. She had an entire staff of brilliant young political strategists. She commanded a digital counter-argument machine that had been running continuously, without pause, since 2019, expertly converting every one of the former president's digital attacks into a highly lucrative fundraising email. Every Republican criticism was instantly metabolized into a flood of small-dollar donations. Every moment of searing national controversy was simply folded into the grand, heroic narrative she was continuously broadcasting to her loyal supporters. I am the woman the establishment is terrified of. I am the voice the powerful cannot silence. Pitch in $25 today, and the strategy had worked. It had worked with brilliant, undeniable efficiency. In fact, her fundraising metrics, following her high-profile committee removal in 2023, had shattered her previous career records. Her national profile expanded exponentially every single time he typed her name into his phone. She had learned through rigorous trial and error that Trump's attention was not an existential threat. It was an incredibly potent, infinitely renewable resource, but the East Room of the White House was not the Internet. In this physical space, on this Thursday afternoon with 40 veteran reporters already physically leaning forward in their chairs, and 12 broadcast cameras locked in rigid focus for the entire apparatus of the American political media, was actively calculating the angle, the framing, and the unreckoner, historical narrative. And crucially, her machine was not in the room. The protective, insulating buffer of her communications apparatus remained 1,000 miles away inside a district office in Minneapolis. All that existed in this room was Omar the president and a deeply divided country, watching in real time, collectively holding its breath to discover what happens when the most relentless, unorthodox verbal combatant in place, the history of American politics, decides to abandon his standard performance art and begin prosecuting a case. Congresswoman Trump said, instantly, something fundamental shifted in his vocal register. This was not the booming theatrical voice he deployed at stadium rallies. It was not his familiar tone of political grievance, nor was it the mocking, exaggerated cadence he utilized to draw laughter from a friendly crowd. It was something noticeably quieter. It was heavy, deliberate, and surgical. It was the specific, dangerous tone of a man who had been dominating high-stakes negotiations for over half a century, and who had on this particular afternoon decided to execute a fundamentally different strategy. I have been wanting to have a conversation with you, he continued, the silence in the room thickening. A real one, in person, not mediated through social media, not filtered through your press office, and certainly not through your campaign's fundraising emails. And by the way, I have seen those fundraising emails. Very well written. My name comes up quite a bit. You are very welcome. A ripple of light, nervous laughter briefly broke the tension. The Republican-leaning members of the press corps shifted eagerly in their seats. The Democratic-leaning correspondents instinctively reached for their phones, sensing a tectonic shift in the news cycle. But I want to have a real conversation today. Trump pressed on the momentary amusement, vanishing from his face, because the people of Minnesota genuinely deserve one. Because I have been reading, and I read a lot, a tremendous amount, more than people know about what has been happening in your home, state, in your specific district, and specifically regarding your family's recent financial history, and what I have been reading is frankly remarkable, though not in a good way. And I think it is past time that somebody asked you about it directly, in a room, on camera, so that the people of Minnesota, the working people who actually sent you to Washington, who trusted you with their sacred votes, who deeply believed in your personal story, can finally hear the answers. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle over the journalists. The East Room was now so profoundly still that one could hear the faint mechanical whir of the camera lenses adjusting their focus. Because right now, he said softly, the answers are missing. To truly comprehend the political earthquake that unfolded over the subsequent 22 minutes, to understand exactly why a routine joint briefing on border enforcement violently morphed into the most downloaded widely dissected political exchange of the first quarter of 2026, generating a staggering 94 million views across platforms within 72 hours and dominating every premium cable broadcast. From Sean Hannity's primetime desk to the early morning roundtables of Morning Joe, one must understand the deep structural context surrounding both of these towering figures. It is a context that the hyperventilating rapid-fire coverage of the modern media environment rarely bothers to explain, simply because explanation requires precious time. And time is the one commodity the Kresge modern political media complex has universally decided it can no longer afford. The first unavoidable truth that must be understood is that Ilhan Omar is, by any objective historical measure, a genuinely remarkable human being. She arrived on American soil in 1995 as a traumatized 12-year-old refugee. She had survived a brutal society, shattering civil war that had claimed the lives of her own family members, enduring 4 grueling years in a Kenyan displacement camp, watching her native country collapse into ash and ruin in ways that the vast majority of comfortable Americans will never be able to fully comprehend. From that devastating starting point, she built a life of extraordinary achievement. She earned a college degree, successfully fought for a seat in her state legislature, and eventually secured a prominent position within the United States Congress, forever etching her name in history as one of the first 2 Muslim women ever elected to the federal government. It is a profound story. It is in the most literal, undeniable, and beautiful sense of quintessential American story. Those who dismiss her journey entirely are willfully blinding themselves to something profoundly important about what this nation is still capable of producing. But the second truth, the dark, complicated reality that created the explosive conditions for what was happening in the East Room, was that Omar had been serving in Congress since January of 2019. 7 long years. 7 years. Representing Minnesota's 5th congressional district, an area encompassing the vibrant, complex heart of Minneapolis and its immediate first-ring suburbs. She had spent 7 years as one of the most prominent, globally celebrated, and nationally visible members of the Salve United States government. 7 years, characterized by glowing magazine profiles, lucrative speaking engagements, flattering documentary films, and prestigious international diplomatic panels. 7 years of relentless political combat, viral moments, floor speeches, and press releases. And yet, at the end of those 7 years, the 5th Congressional District of Minnesota, the actual physical geography containing the actual breathing human beings who relied on her representation, had, by virtually every available empirical metric, gotten tangibly worse. The poverty rate within the 5th District remained stubbornly among the highest of any congressional district in the entire American Midwest. The black residents of Minneapolis, who constituted a vital significant portion of Omar's devoted constituency, were tragically, disproportionately affected, finding themselves approximately 4 times more likely to live below the federal poverty line than their white neighbors. This was not the result of a sudden economic shock. These were chronic conditions that had persisted, and in many ways deepened across the entire span of her tenure. Furthermore, the physical safety of the city had cratered homicides in Minneapolis during the blood-soaked year of 2021. The immediate aftermath of the year, she had loudly, proudly championed the highly controversial movement to defund local law enforcement had spiked to a devastating 97 dead. This grim statistic matched the city's all-time historical record, a dark milestone previously set in 1995. The infamous year, the media had branded the city with the devastating moniker Murderapolis. Prior to 2019, the city had been enjoying a genuine, hard-won downward trajectory in violent crime. That trajectory had been violently reversed. The City Council had voted in June of 2020 to fundamentally dismantle the PROS. Minneapolis Police Department supporters and activists lauded it as a historic, necessary reckoning, and then the murders spiked. The multi-generational small businesses that had barely survived the chaotic summer protests finally surrendered, boarding up their windows and closing their doors forever. The middle-class families who had loved Minneapolis their entire lives began quietly calculating commute times, searching for real estate in the safety of the surrounding suburban counties. Some left immediately. The ones who stayed behind were predominantly the ones who lacked the financial resources to leave, and the paler, citizens who had no choice but to stay, were overwhelmingly the exact same marginalized working-class people who had originally sent Ilhan Omar to Congress to protect them. And looming over all of this civic decay was the staggering reality of the fraud. $9 billion in taxpayer money, vital funds designated for critical community lifelines, child nutrition programs, healthcare clinic grants, early childhood daycare subsidies, and federal food program dollars. All of it had vanished from the state of Minnesota in one of the most audacious large-scale fraud schemes in American history. Federal prosecutors had ultimately charged more than 75 defendants, with many already convicted and facing lengthy prison sentences. A significant portion of those involved hailed directly from the tight-knit Somali community that Omar represented. And while the staggering theft was actively occurring while dogged federal investigators were painstakingly building their criminal cases, while fictitious phantom daycares were effortlessly cashing massive government checks for children who simply did not exist, and while fabricated food programs were invoicing the state for millions of meals that were never cooked, Ilhan Omar had been a fixture on premium cable television and international panels, confidently suggesting that the investigators themselves were motivated by deeply rooted systemic racism. That was the heavy, undeniable record. That was the grim ledger, resting invisibly on the lectern, patiently waiting for someone with the audacity to finally open it in public. "Come up here," Trump instructed, his tone carrying the warm, peculiar quality of a gracious invitation that was, in reality, a lethal dare. It was a tone his senior staff had heard countless times before in raucous campaign arenas, tense corporate boardrooms, civil courtrooms, and high-stakes debate stages. It was the specific tone that signaled an imminent, unavoidable collision, a quiet warning to the press pool that they had better ensure their cameras were rolling. "I want to have this conversation face to face, not shouting at the fourth row. Right here. Come to the microphone." Omar stood. She took her time, It was the deliberate, deeply calculated unhurriedness of a woman who understood at a cellular, instinctual level that how a person physically moved through a room filled with hostile cameras was often just as important as the words they spoke upon arriving at the destination. She methodically smoothed the lapels of her tailored jacket. She explicitly refused to glance down at the phone in her hand. She walked down the aisle toward the secondary microphone, positioned at the front of the room with the steady, measured, unyielding stride of a survivor who had been repeatedly assured she would not last in this brutal industry, yet had been thriving in it for 12 years. She positioned herself exactly 3 feet from the President of the United States. She locked eyes directly with him, her expression a mask of cool defiance. "Mr. President," she said, her voice smooth and echoing with authority, "I certainly appreciate the invitation, though I feel compelled to note that it is remarkably easier to invite someone to a conversation when you exclusively control the room, the microphone, and the television cameras." A ripple of quiet, appreciative laughter spread through the back rows as the Democratic members of the press corps scribbled furious notes, recognizing the elegance of the parry. Trump smiled. It was not his full, expansive rally smile, but a tight, acknowledging smirk, the look of a seasoned prize fighter who had clearly felt the jab accurately clocked exactly where it landed and was already with unhurried efficiency constructing his counterpunch. "I do control the room," he conceded smoothly. "That is a fair point. It is the White House, after all. I live here. But the questions I am going to ask you today, those aren't my questions. Those are not Republican questions drafted by a think tank. Those are Minneapolis's questions. They are the desperate, lingering questions that the struggling people in your own district have been asking quietly for a very long time. And I think today is a magnificent day to finally ask them out loud." He leaned into his microphone. "So let us start with Tim Minette." The name landed heavily in the center of the East Room. It dropped with the specific gravity of a known secret, a name everyone in the Washington establishment was intimately familiar with, but had been collectively waiting to see who possessed the sheer nerve to introduce into a live, televised broadcast. "Your husband Trump," continued, his voice steady. "A great guy, I'm sure, a political consultant, smart, hardworking, and evidently very, very good at his job." How good? Nearly $3 million good, apparently. Nearly $3 million transferred directly from your campaign accounts, from money that your donors, the small dollar donors, the working class people who scraped together $20, $40, $100 because they deeply believed in you and your progressive message, gave to your campaign. Money you collected under the explicit promise to fight for the working people of Minnesota, and you took that money and you sent it directly to your husband's firm. Omar's voice remained perfectly even. It was a practiced, deeply rehearsed tone, a voice that years of serving as the most heavily targeted member of Congress had hardened into a precision instrument. "Mr. President," she stated firmly, "all payments made to our consulting partners were fully exhaustively disclosed to the Federal Election Commission. They were audited and found to be completely within all legal and ethical guidelines. That specific professional arrangement concluded entirely after the 2020 election cycle. Everything was transparent, everything was above board, and everything was disclosed." "Disclosed," Great Trump replied, radiating the cheerful, endlessly patient energy of a man who had been anticipating exactly this specific defense. "I love disclosure. I believe strongly in disclosure. But here is the unfortunate thing about disclosure, Congresswoman. Disclosing something that is technically legal does not inherently make it morally right. It simply means you informed the public while you were doing it. And what you were doing was writing massive checks from your Tessinus, working-class supporters' hard-earned money, and depositing them into your own husband's bank account. Which, and I genuinely want to be charitable here, I really do, is a profoundly strange thing for a public. The servant who talks constantly, endlessly about corporate corruption and political accountability to do. It is a strange action for a woman who has built her entire global brand on calling out the powerful, for enriching themselves at the expense of ordinary people. Don't you think? He did not pause long enough to permit an answer. But let's put that aside. He gestured broadly. Let us say it was all perfectly fine. Let us say the 3 million was clean, entirely proper, no problem whatsoever. Let us talk about what came next, because the story gets much more interesting. Your husband, after the campaign relationship ended, after he was no longer billing your donors for consulting, started a wine company, EST Crew, LLC, a boutique winery based out in California, very sophisticated, very entrepreneurial. He paused. It was the slightest hesitation, but it caused the room to go dead quiet. Ilhan, he said, his voice dropping into a register of faux intimacy. You are a Muslim woman, a deeply devout Muslim woman. You have made your faith a central, celebrated pillar of your public identity, and I respect that. I truly do. Religious expression is deeply important in this country, but in traditional Islam, the production, distribution, and sale of alcohol is strictly prohibited. It is haram. And yet your husband owns a winery. He manufactures wine. He sells wine. He profits handsomely from wine. And you have maintained a complete, absolute public silence about this. Not one single word. Not one press release. Not one explanation. Because providing that explanation would force you to publicly choose between your stated profound religious faith and your household's lucrative income. And that is a choice you have quite apparently decided you are unwilling to make in public. Omar inhaled. It was a sharp, tightly controlled breath, the physical manifestation of a woman aggressively managing her adrenaline. My husband's private business activities are entirely separate from my public service, she countered, her voice icy. My faith is deeply personal, and I am not going to allow the presidential podium to be weaponized to question the sincerity of anyone's religious beliefs. Nobody questioned your beliefs, Trump said, cutting her off with the clean, devastating, unhurried precision of a Wimbledon champion returning a volley at the exact impossible angle that immediately ends the point. I just accurately described them. I described your beliefs exactly as you have publicly stated them. And I described your husband's business exactly as it is publicly documented. They appear to be in direct, glaring contradiction. That is not my personal opinion, Congresswoman. That is an empirical observation. The contradiction is doing all the heavy lifting. Here I am simply reading it out loud. He turned his attention away from her, looking down at his index card. It was the same familiar style of index card that over 7 years of brutal political combat had become as recognizable as any prop in American political history. Now he said, the atmosphere in the room turning colder. Let us talk about the money, because the money is significantly harder to explain away with a press release. In 2023, your husband's new company, Rose Lake Capital, a venture capital firm, was officially valued at somewhere between $1 and $1,000. That is exactly what you legally reported on your own mandatory federal financial disclosure forms. $1 to $1,000. Not exactly a massive enterprise, a struggling startup, perhaps. Maybe just a dream on paper. He looked up from the card, locking eyes with her again. And then, in 2024, just 1 year later, that exact same company was suddenly worth $30 million. Not 30,000, not 300,000, $30 million in a single year, from less than $1,000 to $30 million. He let the number hang in the silence, heavy and undeniable. I am a businessman, Congresswoman, he said, his voice resonant with decades of boardroom authority. I have been a highly successful businessman for my entire adult life. I have scrutinized a lot of complex financial statements. I have evaluated, negotiated, and closed a lot of massive deals. And I am telling you as someone who knows exactly what $30 million looks like and who understands exactly what it takes to generate that kind of explosive growth in 12 months for an entity that was worth essentially nothing a year earlier. That does not happen from simply selling boutique wine. It certainly does not happen from standard venture capital returns in a normal, regulated market. That specific kind of astronomical growth only happens when an external entity possessing massive liquid resources injects them directly into a company very, very quickly. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. And the urgent question that the House Oversight Committee has been repeatedly asking, the question that federal financial investigators have been quietly pursuing, and most importantly, the question that the working essence families of Minnesota desperately deserve an answer to, is who suddenly poured $30 million into your husband's dormant company during the exact same year, when 75 individuals from your own community were being indicted for stealing $9 billion from the state. The room was paralyzed. The silence was so profound that the soft, rhythmic clicking of a single photographer's shutter sounded like a metronome marking the time. We don't know the answer. Trump continued, relentless. Your husband completely missed the Congressional Oversight Committee's formal deadline for producing those business records. Missed it completely. Your official congressional office publicly dismissed the investigation as a, let me find the exact quote, because I want to be perfectly precise here, a political stunt. Those were your team's exact words. A political stunt. $30 million mysteriously materializes in your household's net worth in a single year. Federal investigators are actively circling. Official travel records are being requested regarding trips to the United Arab Emirates, Somalia, and Kenya. And your response was to look the public in the eye, call the investigation a stunt. Omar leaned forward into her microphone. When she spoke, there was a palpable shift in her vocal resonance. It wasn't raw anger exactly, but rather the highly compressed, intensely heated energy that bubbles just beneath the surface of anger. It was the desperate voice of a person whose deeply curated, meticulously protected personal mythology was being violently dismantled on live television in a manner that could not simply be deflected with a pithy tweet or a fundraising link. Mr. President, she fired back, her words clipped and forceful. The House Oversight Committee is currently led by hyper-partisan bad-faith Republicans who have made targeting me personally a political priority since the day I was first elected to office. There is absolutely no evidence, none whatsoever, connecting me or my family to any fraud in the state of Minnesota. Zero. The Ethics Committee received the partisan referral and has produced zero findings simply because there are no findings to produce. And for you to stand up here behind the presidential seal and irresponsibly imply otherwise, without evidence, without formal charges, with nothing but cheap innuendo. I am not implying anything. Trump interrupted, his voice cutting through hers with cold authority. I am simply reading the legally mandated financial disclosure forms that you yourself filed under penalty of perjury. The federal forms that explicitly show your household went from reporting a negative net worth. In 2019, you stated publicly you had mounting student loans and zero assets to possessing a net worth of between $6 and $30 million by the end of 2024. Those are your numbers, Congresswoman. I didn't invent them. You filed them. He turned his gaze away from her, addressing the room of reporters, addressing the camera lenses, addressing the nation. Now, Maybe there is a perfectly innocent, totally clean explanation for all of this. Maybe your husband is a genuinely generational, brilliant venture capitalist who managed to construct a $30 million portfolio from scratch in 12 months through sheer, unadulterated financial genius. Maybe all the unknown investors are completely legitimate. Maybe the corporate records are all pristine, and maybe the sudden, extensive travel to 3 foreign nations with direct known financial connections to a staggering $9 billion federal fraud investigation is just a completely random, unfortunate coincidence. Maybe he looked back at her. I would love to know. So would the Oversight Committee, so would the federal prosecutors, and so would the desperate, struggling people of Minneapolis who are currently waiting for their famous Congresswoman to simply stand up and say, "Here are the documents $1 million came from. And here is exactly why my family went from being completely broke to being multimillionaires, while $9 billion was systematically stolen from your children's free school lunch programs." He paused. The silence stretched out, extending long enough to become physically uncomfortable for everyone in the room. We are all still waiting. Before anyone could interject, before the press corps could erupt into questions, Trump shifted his posture. "But here is what I really want to talk about," he said. His voice shifted for the third distinct time in the exchange. It dropped out of the aggressive prosecutorial register and settled into something much quieter. And in many ways, it was far more devastating. "Because the money is just one part of the story," he murmured, "and the Ethics Committee will eventually decide what it decides, and the federal investigators will methodically follow the evidence wherever it ultimately leads them. That is their job. My job, right now, standing in this room, is to ask you about your job." He looked down at a fresh index card. "You have been the elected Congresswoman for Minnesota's 5th District since January of 2019. 7 years. 7 years serving in the United States Congress. And in those 7 years, you have appeared on national television, approximately 10,000 times. You have conducted hundreds of high-profile interviews. You have flown to Geneva to speak at prestigious international human rights conferences. You have addressed the General Assembly of the United Nations. You have been beautifully photographed for the cover of Time magazine. You have been the exclusive subject of a glossy documentary film that premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival. You even made a cameo in a Maroon 5 music video, which, quite honestly, is probably the most distinguished accomplishment on that entire list. And I happen to like Maroon 5. A wave of light, highly nervous laughter rippled through the room, releasing a fraction of the suffocating tension, functioning much like a steam valve releasing pressure before being aggressively tightened again. But in those exact same 7 years, Trump continued the humor instantly draining from his face in your actual district. In Minneapolis, the physical city where the actual breathing people live who actually stood in line to elect you, the following things happened. The poverty rate remained firmly stuck among the highest in the entire Midwest, with your black residents forced to live in poverty at a rate approximately 4 times higher than their white neighbors. Homicides in 2021 skyrocketed to 97 dead bodies, matching the city's grim all-time historical record, the exact same record it set in 1995, the year the nation called your city Murderapolis. He pointed a finger directly at her podium. And that massive, tragic spike in homicides happened directly, undeniably, after your movement. And I want to be abundantly clear. I am calling it your movement, because you were its most vocal, prominent national champion pushed, the Minneapolis City Council, to aggressively defund the police. Omar's outward expression had not fractured. The mask of weaponized serenity remained largely in place. But to an observant eye, something had undeniably shifted behind her gaze. It wasn't entirely visible, but it was, perceptible in the exact same way. A sudden, violent change in Ludedeninding's barometric pressure is perceptible right before the first drop of a massive storm falls. And here is the tragic reality about the police. Congresswoman Trump said, his voice laced with a heavy, grim sorrow. When you proudly defunded the police, when you and your progressive colleagues went on national cable news and enthusiastically chanted, "Defund the police and abolish ICE, and tear down the system," you were not engaging in some abstract, academic, ideological exercise on a college campus. You were executing a real-world policy in a real living city, with real, dangerous streets and real, vulnerable people attempting to survive on those streets. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. And those people, the working-class people who could not afford to simply pack up and leave Minneapolis when the violent crime spiraled out of control. The people who did not possess a second home in the quiet suburbs. The parents who were exhausted, working 2 minimum-wage jobs, and terrified of sending their children to public schools in the specific neighborhoods where the shootings were happening daily. Those people paid the bloody price. Not you. He gestured to the Secret Service agents standing quietly at the perimeter of the room. You have an armed security detail. You have been heavily protected by federal law enforcement at the taxpayer's expense. Since at least 2019, you are safe. But the desperate people living in Minneapolis's most vulnerable, forgotten neighborhoods did not have a personal security detail. They only had whatever the depleted, defunded, utterly demoralized local police force that your political movement created was able to provide, which, as the body count proved, was not nearly enough. Omar spoke. Her voice was still tightly controlled, but the sheer effort required to maintain that control was now costing her something profound. The microphone picked up the slight ragged edge of her expenditure. "Mr. President," she said, her tone trembling with defensive indignation. The grassroots movement for police accountability that organically emerged in the summer of 2020 was a direct, necessary, and righteous response to the brutal murder of George Floyd, who was tragically killed in my own district by a corrupt police officer while the entire city was forced to watch. I will never under any circumstances apologize for standing shoulder to shoulder with the grieving families who rightfully demanded systemic accountability for that horrific killing. And your cynical conflation of righteous demands for accountability with broader complex fluctuations in crime rates is a deliberate, bad faith misrepresentation of what actually happened. George Floyd Trump said, his voice suddenly transforming again. It was completely stripped of the prosecutorial edge. It lacked the theatricality of a debate. It was simply the flat, heavy, mournful tone of a man stating an ugly fact he deeply wished were not true. Was an absolute tragedy. It was wrong. I stood at a podium and said it was wrong at the time. And the police officer responsible for that death was tried, convicted by a jury, and went to federal prison. That is the justice system working. That is the definition of accountability. He looked at her with a chilling stillness. But here is the devastating part. There were 47 other homicide victims bleeding out on the streets of Minneapolis in 2019, before George Floyd, before the massive protests, before the disastrous movement to defund law enforcement. 47 people violently killed. And then, after the defunding, after the movement, after everything your progressive coalition successfully did to dismantle Minneapolis policing under the banner of accountability, there were 97 dead in 2021. More than double. He let the mathematics settle over the room, and every single one of those additional 50 victims had a name. They had a terrified family. They had mothers and fathers who loved them desperately, and who are still to this very day weeping over their graves. And I want to ask you, I genuinely, sincerely want to ask you, Because I do not believe a single journalist has ever possessed the courage to ask you this directly on camera and hold the microphone to your face until you gave a real answer. He leaned in closer. How many of those 50 additional dead people knew your name? How many of them followed your glamorous life on Twitter? How many of them were alive long enough to click a link and donate $25 to your next re-election campaign? Silence. It was a suffocating, terrifying silence. It was the highly specific, deeply uncomfortable silence of a room in which a devastating moral question has been asked that simply does not possess a defensible answer. And every single veteran, the political operative in the room knows it, and the person standing at the podium who most desperately needs to answer it knows it better than anyone. The struggling people of Minneapolis do not need an international symbol, Trump said softly. They need a congresswoman. They desperately need someone who actually comes home, who physically walks the broken streets and knocks on the doors, who sits in living rooms with the grieving families, who is willing to ask the brutal, hard questions about why the massive fraud was allowed to happen, why the money is missing, why the state safety nets were so easily exploited, why $9 billion that was explicitly supposed to feed hungry children ended up financing someone's luxury lifestyle. His voice grew firmer, anchored by an unyielding demand for reality. They need a leader who stands up and says, "This disaster happened in my district, on my watch, and I am going to move heaven and earth to do something about it." Not a celebrity politician who immediately runs to a television studio to complain that the federal investigators trying to recover the stolen money are just a bunch of racists. They need something real. Omar had been absorbing the rhetorical blows with the stoic endurance she always displayed. She was calculating, waiting for the optimal opening to counterattack. She had survived infinitely harder rooms than this gilded chamber she had, stood defiantly on the chaotic floor of the House of 12, representatives and read controversial names into the permanent congressional record, while furious colleagues demonstratively walked out. She had received graphic death threats so credible and terrifying required her to constantly alter her travel routes home from the Capitol complex. She had endured things that would have permanently shattered most traditional political careers, yet she was still standing here. And the sheer, undeniable, the fact of her survival was in her own deeply held understanding of herself, the single most important political asset she possessed. She leaned aggressively into the microphone. She spoke with the composed, deliberate, lethal force of a seasoned warrior who had concluded that the time for passively absorbing punishment was definitively over. "I want to respond comprehensively to several of the inflammatory things that have just been leveled at me," she declared, her voice projecting power, because the American people watching this broadcast deserve the actual truth, not a dull, cynical partisan performance. She locked her gaze directly onto Trump, completely ignoring the banks of cameras. "My district is the 5th congressional district of the great state of Minnesota. It is undeniably one of the most vibrant, complex, and beautiful melting pots in the United States of America. It is home to hard-working immigrants from Somalia, Ethiopia, Vietnam, Mexico, and virtually every forgotten corner of the globe. It is a sanctuary for resilient people who arrived on these shores with absolutely nothing in their pockets and miraculously built something beautiful. It is home to hundreds of thousands of people who look exactly like me and who have never, in the entire sprawling history of this country, had a single representative in the halls of Congress who looked like them or who intimately understood what their daily spent struggles were like, or who was finally willing to fight viciously for their interests against a massive entrenched system that has spent generations treating them as entirely invisible. She was gaining momentum. The practiced, media-trained calm was evolving into something raw and genuinely powerful. You cynically weaponize the poverty rate. The poverty rate in my district remains unacceptably high because of decades of systematic racist disinvestment in communities of color. Those are deep structural inequalities that predate my historic election by generations. Inequalities. What I have done, what every single day of my 7 years in Congress has been dedicated to, is fighting relentlessly to dismantle them. And I have had to fight against a hostile Republican majority that has ruthlessly slashed affordable housing funds, gutted critical healthcare expansions, decimated public education budgets, and destroyed every single social program that might have actually made a material difference. All while fiercely protecting massive corporate tax cuts for the port, billionaires sitting comfortably in rooms exactly like this one. Her voice echoed with genuine righteous indignation. You mentioned the fraud in Minnesota. Let me be perfectly clear. The fraud in Minnesota is real. It is a betrayal, and it is profoundly serious. The criminals who orchestrated it absolutely deserve to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Every single one of them, I have stated that publicly, repeatedly, and on the record. What I have also stated, and what I will continue to say, is that cynically using a localized fraud investigation as a convenient excuse to traumatize, terrorize an entire ethnic community, to deploy heavily armed federal agents into peaceful neighborhoods in numbers that far exceed the local police presence, to aggressively threaten the deportation of innocent people who have been proud Americans for decades, to indiscriminately freeze child. Nutrition programs, because a few bad actors lied, is not justice. It is draconian collective punishment, and the collective punishment of an entire minority community for the isolated crimes of a few individuals is a dark authoritarian tactic that I, as someone who has deeply studied the bloody history of this world, immediately recognize. She paused for a masterful dramatic beat, and then she confidently delivered the kill shot. The specific, devastating line her elite communications team had meticulously prepared for exactly this moment. The line she had quietly rehearsed in the back of her armored SUV on the ride from Capitol Hill. The precise sequence of words that was scientifically designed to be clipped, heavily boosted on social media, and featured prominently in every progressive fundraising email for the next 3 months. You, Mr. President, she said, her voice dripping with refined contempt, have built an entire political career out of peddling fear. Fear of immigrants, fear of Muslims, fear of strong, independent women who absolutely refuse to be quiet. And every single time you stand behind a podium and point your finger at someone who looks like me, demanding to know where the money came from, you are not conducting legitimate oversight. You are doing exactly what you have always done. You are signaling to a certain dark element of America that people who look like me do not truly belong here. And after everything I have survived in my life, the refugee camp, the Civil War, the relentless death threats, all of it I have to tell. With all due respect, that strategy is not going to work on me. The East Room held its collective breath. Even the frantic clicking of the cameras seemed to momentarily freeze. Trump let the heavy silence hang in the air. The pause was a deeply calculated theatrical maneuver, and every seasoned political veteran in the room recognized it as such. And yet, it worked brilliantly anyway, because the pregnant pause communicated a very clear message. I heard your absolute best shot. I am entirely unafraid of what you just said, and I have a response. That was very well said, Trump murmured finally. His voice was shockingly quiet, almost conversational. Very well written, I should say, because that was clearly a prepared speech. And it was a good one. It masterfully hit all the required emotional notes. The refugee camp, the Civil War, the accusations of Islamophobia, the grand narrative of fear. Very, very effective political theater. Your communications team is excellent. I would grade that speech a solid A-. He looked at her, his eyes devoid of anger, reflecting only a cold, clinical assessment. But here is what your beautifully written speech deliberately failed to do, Congresswoman. Your speech completely failed to answer the fundamental question about where the $30 million came from. Your speech entirely failed to explain why your husband's business records have still not been surrendered to the Oversight Committee. Your speech offered absolutely zero comfort to the desperate parents in North Minneapolis who suddenly discovered the daycares their children relied on were complete fictions. Your speech offered no explanation to the struggling grandmother whose vital food assistance was callously siphoned off by criminals submitting fraudulent invoices while you were busy spending your time sitting on glamorous panels discussing international affairs. Instead of asking basic questions about where the money in your own backyard was going. He shook his head slowly, devoid of his usual bombastic theatrics. It was a gesture of genuine, profound weariness. You boldly stated that the fraudsters deserved to be prosecuted. Fine, we agree. Good. But what you did not say, what you have never said in 7 long years is simply, I am deeply sorry that this massive betrayal happened in my district. I am sorry that I was not paying close enough attention to see it coming. I am sorry. I did not ask the hard questions, and I am going to do everything in my earthly power to guarantee it never, ever happens again. You didn't say that. Instead, you immediately went on television and claimed the federal investigators were the real problem. You cried collective punishment. You screamed Islamophobia. When $9 billion vanishes from children's lunch trays in your own district, Trump said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, the very first question a leader asks is not, are the investigators racist? The question is, where did the money go? Who stole it and what exactly was I doing while they were stealing it? Omar's response was razor-sharp and instantaneous. I personally introduced comprehensive legislation in 2022, explicitly designed to massively strengthen the oversight mechanisms for all federal child nutrition programs. She countered fiercely. And what happened to that vital legislation? Trump asked seamlessly. It did not advance out of committee because partisan Republicans, your party, controlled the House in 2021 and 2022. Democrats held the absolute majority during that period. Trump corrected her, his tone completely flat, devoid of triumph, just stating an empirical fact. A brutal, unscripted pause hung in the air. It was not a theatrical pause this time. It was the devastating silence of a politician caught in a fatal factual error on live television. There were complex committee scheduling conflicts. Omar finally managed her legendary composure, cracking by a microscopic fraction. There were competing legislative priorities. Competing priorities, Trump repeated. He didn't say it mockingly. He simply repeated her exact words, allowing their sheer grotesque inadequacy to slowly suffocate the room. $9 billion being systematically poisoned, stolen from the mouths of starving children. And the Story 10. Congresswoman cites competing priorities. He took a slow, deep breath. I want to say one final thing, he said, and his voice dropped even further. It was incredibly quiet now, and somehow, paradoxically, the quietness made it deafening. Because in the brutal arena of high-stakes politics, quiet things demand that the audience physically lean in to listen. In March of 2019, Trump began his eyes fixed firmly on hers. 7 years ago, you delivered a keynote address to the Council on American-Islamic Relations out in California, and during that speech, you chose to discuss the September 11th terrorist attacks. You described the terrorist attacks. The darkest day in modern American history, the day that 3,000 innocent Americans were slaughtered, the most devastating foreign attack on American soil. An attack that incinerated brave firefighters, office workers, janitors, stockbrokers, and innocent people from 190 different countries who just happened to be sitting at their desks in Lower Manhattan that bright Tuesday morning. The East Room was absolutely paralyzed. You described that horrific, world-altering massacre. Trump said, his voice trembling slightly with suppressed emotion, as some people did something. He let the words hang in the air, like a physical weight. Some people did something. He didn't say it with contempt. He didn't attempt to make a joke out of it. He just let her own words poison the silence. Now, he continued softly, I have heard every conceivable focus-grouped explanation for that specific phrase. I have been aggressively lectured by the media that it was taken completely out of context. I have been told you were actually discussing the nuances of civil liberties, not the visceral reality of the attack itself. I have been assured that the video clip was maliciously edited by right-wing operatives, and frankly, maybe some of that is true. He took a step out from behind the imposing wooden lectern. But here is what I know to be absolutely true. A man named Nicholas Haros Jr., a man from New Jersey. He lost his beloved mother in the World Trade Center that morning. His mother's name was Frances. She was a hard-working woman, employed by a financial firm up on the 88th floor of the South Tower. And on the 18th solemn anniversary of those attacks, Nicholas Haros Jr. stood weeping at Ground Zero in New York City, attending the sacred ceremony where they painstakingly read the names of the dead. And as he stood on the ashes of his mother's grave, he wore a simple black T-shirt, and printed across the chest of that shirt were 4 words. Some people did something. Trump's eyes were locked on Omar. They were not filled with political calculation now. They were filled with the heavy, terrible weight of history. And Nicholas looked directly into the television cameras. Trump whispered, and he said, Today, I am here to respond to you exactly who did what, to whom. He was talking directly to you, Congresswoman. That broken man, that grieving son. Standing at the exact epicenter where his mother, he was vaporized. He heard exactly how you chose to describe the absolute worst, most agonizing day of his entire life. He heard the specific dismissive words you casually selected, and he felt so deeply violated by them that he marched to Ground Zero and wore those exact words on his chest, so that you and the entire world would be forced to look at them. Trump paused, letting the emotional devastation of the anecdote settle deep into the bones of everyone listening. Because he felt, as a son whose mother was murdered, that the casual phrase, "some people did something," completely failed to do justice to the unspeakable horror his mother endured. What 3,000 people endured, what their shattered families are still enduring every single day. A long, agonizing beat of silence followed. "I am not standing here saying that you hate America," Trump said quietly. "I am not saying that you are un-American. What I am saying is that words possess profound power. I am saying that when you are elevated to the incredible privilege of serving as a member of the United States Congress, and you choose to publicly describe an attack that slaughtered 3,000 of your fellow citizens, you possess a sacred, unbreakable moral responsibility to those victims and their grieving families. To locate words that are actually adequate to describe what happened to them." He shook his head. "And some people did something is not adequate. It has never been adequate. And the damning reality that you have never, not once in 7 entire years, across 10,000 glossy television interviews, impassioned floor, speeches and glowing magazine profiles, found the humility to simply apologize and find different words for that agonizing moment. That is something the hard-working people of Minnesota's 5th District possess every right to deeply reconsider." Omar stood frozen behind her microphone. "You loudly accuse me of building my career on fear." Trump continued, his voice regaining its structural strength. "And perhaps you are right. Perhaps some of my political supporters are motivated by anxiety about the future. That is a debate worth having. But let us be honest about your career. Congresswoman, what are the specific emotions that fuel your political engine? Because from where I am standing, your entire brand runs exclusively on grievance. It runs on the potent, highly profitable idea that America is a fundamentally evil place that has done terrible things to people who look like you, and that your only job is to furiously fight back against it forever. Regardless of what is actually happening on the ground in the crumbling city, you were elected to serve. He took a step back toward the podium. That is an incredibly powerful story. I admit it. It resonates deeply with people. It raises millions of dollars in small donations. It fills massive arenas with cheering crowds. And I understand that because I have a very similar Acton Salesian, powerful story of my own. But eventually, stories have to connect to reality. They have to connect to the physical streets, to the failing public schools, to the dangerous neighborhoods where real people are trying to survive. And when the grand political story completely disconnects from the bleeding streets, when the Congresswoman is sitting in a television studio lecturing the country about Gaza, while completely fictitious daycares are stealing millions from her own constituents, when the Congresswoman is walking the red carpet at the Tribeca Film Festival while $9 billion is evaporating from Minnesota. That is the exact moment when the story stops being noble advocacy and mutates into something entirely different. He repositioned himself behind the presidential seal. When he spoke next, it was with the undeniable gravitational pull of a man assessing his own legacy. "My family came to this country," he said softly. "My mother immigrated from Scotland. My grandfather arrived from Germany. They arrived with absolutely nothing. They arrived in a nation that was not always welcoming or kind to immigrants. But they worked. They built something tangible. And I have. I spent my entire adult life building things. Massive skyscrapers, global companies, a political movement, a presidency. And I know exactly what building looks like. Building looks like undeniable, physical results. Building looks like something you can proudly point to and declare, I made that. That exists in the real world because of my effort." He stared directly at her, his voice echoing through the silent, gilded room. "So I ask you, Congresswoman, what exactly did you build? Not for your personal celebrity, not for your global brand, not for the international human rights panels, or the glossy documentary films, or the 47 co-sponsored bills that never even made it to a floor vote. What did you build for Minneapolis? What did you build for the people of the 5th District? For the terrified grandmother in North Minneapolis whose grocery assistance was stolen? For the kid in South Minneapolis whose public school is bankrupt? For the family who poured their life savings into a small business only to watch it burn to the ground while the city became a war zone for 2 straight years? What he asked, the word striking like a hammer on an anvil, did you build? The ensuing silence lasted far longer than any silence had a right to last. In a room occupied by 40 aggressive political reporters, Omar finally spoke. "I represent more than 400,000 diverse, resilient people in the 5th Congressional District, and I will proudly put my unyielding record of progressive advocacy for those people up against any politician in this country." Advocacy, Trump repeated. The word tasted like ash. 7 years of passionate advocacy for 400,000 people living in one of the poorest, most dangerous districts in the Midwest. And after all that advocacy, the crushing poverty rate remains exactly the same. The violent crime skyrocketed and only came partway back down. $9 billion was looted from children. And when the federal investigators finally arrived to figure out where the money vanished, to your advocacy consisted of calling them Islamophobes. He turned entirely to the press corps. He was no longer performing. The performance had ended the moment he invoked the name of Francis Haros. What was happening now was an autopsy. "Here is what I fundamentally know about public service," he said, his voice stripped of all pretense. "The struggling people of Minneapolis's 5th District deserve a representative who wakes up in the middle of the night terrified about them. Not about the conflict in Gaza, not about the VIP reception at the Tribeca Film Festival, not about the conversion rates on the next midnight fundraising email, about them. About the exhausted mother working a double shift who still cannot afford basic rent, about the terrified family whose child has fallen hopelessly behind in a failing school, about the devastated business owner who permanently locked their doors, about the thousands of people who are simply gone now, who surrendered, who gave up on Minneapolis and fled to Wisconsin or Iowa, just looking for a place that felt safe, because the beautiful city they grew up in stopped feeling like it belonged to them." He paused, gathering himself, and then delivered the final devastating sentence that would instantly anchor every major news broadcast in the country. The sentence that political operatives would quote to each other in hushed tones for weeks to come. The story of Ilhan Omar escaping a brutal refugee camp and ascending to the United States Congress is a genuinely breathtakingly remarkable story, Trump said softly. "I truly mean that. And I believe that somewhere inside that incredible narrative, there was a potential version of this that could have been truly extraordinary. A brilliant woman who intimately understood trauma and hardship at a level most Americans never will, utilizing that profound empathy to ruthlessly rebuild the city she represented, fighting for every single vulnerable person in it with the specific, terrifying ferocity of someone who knows exactly what it is like to have nothing." He looked at her, his eyes reflecting a profound, surprising sense of political tragedy. "That version of this story that would have really been something," he shook his head slowly, "I just don't know what happened to it." 14 minutes later, precisely as the event concluded, Omar's pre-scheduled digital post went live across all platforms. Trump just spent an hour in the East Room, viciously attacking a refugee woman who built her American dream from a dusty tent in Kenya. It is the exact same tired playbook, same manufactured fear, same racist hatred. It is not going to work. Donate $25 today if you're still standing. With us, link in bio. The post was a digital juggernaut, instantly accumulating 7 million organic impressions within the first 2 hours. The uncut high-definition video of the entire two-minute exchange racked up an astonishing 94 million views across platforms within 72 hours, easily cementing its status as the most watched, obsessively analyzed political confrontation of the quarter. The public reactions immediately fractured along the familiar deep-seated architectural fault lines of American political tribalism. The liberal media ecosystem aggressively praised Omar's stoic composure. They lauded her powerful, defiant speech about collective punishment. MSNBC played the dramatic moment she stared him down and declared, "That is not going to do." Work on a continuous, triumphant loop. Her Act Blue fundraising portal hauled in a staggering $4 million in a matter of 48 hours. Progressive influencers on Twitter universally declared it a massive, humiliating self-own for the president, citing it as definitive proof of his authoritarian impulses. Conversely, the conservative media apparatus seized upon the financial revelations. They ran endless segments dissecting the mysterious $30 million venture capital valuation. They highlighted the 75 indicted fraudsters. They displayed terrifying graphs of the 97 murders directly following the defund the police push. And most devastatingly, they played the clip of Trump recounting the story of Nicholas Harros Jr. Standing at Ground Zero, Fox News aired the footage of the grieving son. The words, "Some people did something," printed across his chest. 17 distinct times before the 11 p.m. broadcast. But out in the vast, quiet expanse of the country, something else was happening. The millions of citizens watching who did not already possess a rigidly fixed opinion. The exhausted, persuadable middle. The uncertain voters who had once sympathized with Omar, but had recently started harboring quiet doubts. The moderates, who fundamentally disliked Trump's abrasive style, but had also watched Minneapolis decay over 7 years with growing horror. Those people noticed something critical. It was something that the hyper-partisan cable news coverage was utterly unequipped to analyze. It was a reality that could not be successfully litigated in a Twitter thread managed by an elite crisis communications team or conveniently converted into a $25 Act Blue donation. Omar had not answered the question about the $30 million. She had simply dismissed it as a political stunt. Omar had not provided any tangible explanation for how her household had rocketed from a negative net worth to possessing millions in assets while occupying public office. She had simply attacked the messenger. And most damningly, Omar had completely failed to articulate what her 7 years of unprecedented global power had actually produced for the desperate suffering people of the specific district she was sworn to protect. When directly asked by the President of the United States, standing under the chandeliers of the White House, what she had tangibly built, her only defense was that she had engaged in advocacy, 47 co-sponsored bills that had never passed. A prominent Democratic strategist, speaking to Politico under the strict condition of anonymity, provided the brutal, unvarnished quote that the article's author found simply too insightful not to publish. The fundamental problem here isn't that Trump attacked her on her identity. She's better equipped for that specific fight than anyone else in the country. The fatal problem is that when he paused and asked her what she had actually done to fix Minneapolis, she had to pivot to talking about advocacy. And the working people of Minneapolis know exactly what advocacy means. It means absolutely nothing changed. There was a secondary, much deeper dimension to the political damage that took several days to fully metastasize. For the past 3 years, Omar's entire formidable political brand had been constructed around one single, simple, electrifying premise. I am the woman they are terrified of. Every attack from the right, every censure motion, every manufactured controversy, she had brilliantly converted all of it into definitive proof of that premise. It was the engine of her celebrity. It was the source of her fundraising. But the brutal forensic dissection in the East Room had introduced a dangerous new question that her brand could not easily dismiss. Afraid of what exactly? Were they afraid of the devastating federal fraud investigation that she was casually dismissing as a stunt? Were they afraid of the subpoenaed financial records her husband flatly refused to produce? Were they afraid of the inexplicable $30 million windfall? The narrative of "they are afraid of me because I speak truth to power" required an underlying foundation of unimpeachable moral strength. It required a legislative record that, when subjected to intense scrutiny, justified the fear. But the relentless examination that had occurred in the East Room was not an examination of her identity, her harrowing origins, or her religious faith. It had been a cold, empirical examination of the ledger, and the ledger was spectacularly empty. A week after the confrontation, the House Oversight Committee formally extended its deadline for Tim Mynett's business records for a second time. Federal investigators methodically continued their silent, aggressive work. Staggering $30 million valuation remained entirely unexplained, its true source undisclosed, its potential connection to the massive Minnesota fraud network, hovering like a dark cloud over her office. And back in the 5th Congressional District of Minnesota, in the working-class neighborhoods, the quiet mosques, the bustling community centers, the underfunded public schools, and the aging apartment complexes where the people who had believed most fervently in the beautiful promise of Ilhan Omar's story lived their difficult daily lives. The brutal reality remained unchanged. The massive $9 billion fraud had happened. The local police force had been fundamentally broken. The daycares had been phantom operations designed to steal. The millions of dollars had vanished into the ether. Suffocating poverty rate had not budged a single inch. The murder rate had spiked horrifically and only retreated slightly. The beloved local businesses had shuttered their windows permanently, and the citizens who possessed the financial means to flee had already packed moving trucks and left. They did not leave because Donald Trump gave a speech. They left because the undeniable empirical records dictated the grim reality of their lives. And the records, unlike the slickly produced fundraising emails, unlike the highly edited viral TikTok clips, unlike the glamorous magazine covers, the Tribeca documentary films, and the 47 symbolic bills that never saw the light of a congressional vote. The records did not require a brilliant communications team to exist. They simply required an honest person to read them. The cold, unforgiving thing about a public record is that it does not care about your narrative. It does not care about how difficult your journey was, how many harrowing obstacles you overcame, or how many powerful enemies tried to stop. Is your ascent. A record is simply the sum total of what actually occurred. It is the unyielding arithmetic of the decisions made, the priorities selected, the fights aggressively picked, and the crucial battles quietly avoided. It is visible to anyone possessing the courage to look. It cannot be elegantly explained away by a beautifully written speech about systemic injustice. It cannot be fundraised out of existence by a viral post about collective fear. In 2028, or perhaps 2030, or whenever, Ilhan Omar inevitably steps onto a brightly lit stage in front of a much broader American electorate and demands a position of even greater national power than she currently wields. Someone is going to stop her. Someone is going to ask her about the ashes of Minneapolis. They will ask her about the massive fraud, the unexplained millions, the 97 bodies, the dismantled police force, and the trail of symbolic legislation. Someone is going to look her in the eye and ask her what she built. And the devastating truth is that the answer will never be found in a 9:00 p.m. fundraising email. The answer will remain forever etched in the cold, hard records, in the unyielding numbers, in the broken streets of the city, in the weary faces of the people who were forced to stay behind, and in the Ennistrong 17-7 taillights of the people who finally gave up and left.